Hey, I'm Vedant, and I'm going to present our work to understand the role of daily activities in job performance with organizational personas. At the workplace, may it be an employee or an employer, there are multiple stakeholders who are in pursuit to find factors that explain and optimize job performance. One of the well-established factors is personality type. The heat map over here shows two such types based on the composition of a worker's personality traits. The top row, or the resilient personality type, describes individuals with aspirational qualities like high conscientiousness and high openness. Typically, in comparison to, say, the under control personality type, the resilient type indicates better job performance. However, since personality is relatively robust to change, examining that factor alone limits personnel management units from improving job performance. In fact, stakeholders need to identify mutable factors associated with job performance so that they can suggest actionable changes. Actually, the domain literature does have some frameworks that provide more holistic and flexible views of job performance. Particularly, a worker's dynamic situational context should be related to their performance. In the wild, this context can be reflected by a worker's day-level activities. So our research aim is to empirically examine how a worker's day-level activities and that context is associated with their outcomes, irrespective of what their personality is. So the data we use in the study comes from the Tesserae project. This is a study that leverages passive sensors that aim to predict well-being dynamics of information workers. The project includes various data streams, including wearables, smartphones, Bluetooth, and social media. Along with that, there are validated survey instruments that serve as ground truth assessments for job performance, as well as let us measure personality traits. With these multiple streams, we first identify certain mutable day-level activities. By mutable, we're referring to features that can be potentially modulated and actionably changed by the individual themselves. So for instance, we look at a variety of contexts, such as physical activities, sleep patterns, mobility, phone activity, and even desk activity at work. Now, to complement the way individuals are described based on their personality, we take a person-centered approach to describe workers' activity context. Essentially, this approach encourages us to cluster the workers based on their various activity features, and we find two dominant groups. If you pay attention to the heat map here, each row represents one of those clusters, and that describes them on the basis of the significant dimensions. A brighter color implies a higher value, and a darker one implies a lower value. Consider the activity cluster C2, which is the second row. This group shows batched phone use, which possibly implies lower interruptions and longer sessions on the phone. They also have transient desk dwelling, which means they spend more time away from their desk, which could indicate meetings. And they also have higher sleep in comparison to the other cluster. By using both the personality and activity context together, we can now describe people more holistically by expressing both their static intrinsic qualities as well as their dynamic mutable context. So when we clustered our workers in the sample based on their personality types, we also found the same two clusters that I mentioned earlier, which is the resilient and the under control type. Additionally, we now also incorporate the activity context, and together that forms an organizational persona. Therefore, there are two possible values for each cluster. So this way we now have a 2x2 significant main effect test. The reason we perform this test is to figure out if the activity matters at all. We find from our experiments that the activity context is a significant factor for all job performance measures. I'm going to elaborate on one of them, which is citizenship behavior. So this is essentially a metric that describes tasks outside of someone's formal job role, such as assisting a colleague. For this measure, we see that activity context actually has a larger effect size than personality. If you notice the graph on the right, we find that overall workers in the under control personality type exhibit a lower citizenship behavior. This is expected from the literature. However, if these workers also demonstrate batched phone use and better sleep, their citizenship behavior is actually higher, and in some cases as much as certain workers from the resilient category. So together, this approach now provides empirical evidence to suggest that even with the same personality type, different activity contexts can significantly indicate performance. This presents organizations an opportunity to use sensing technologies, identify these personas in their workforce, and then test the effect that changing certain contexts could have on their workers' performance. In conclusion, Organizational personas are essentially a framework to evaluate workers based on their mutable day-level activities. I urge you to check out the full paper to get a better understanding of our computational method, an interpretation of our findings, as well as the implications of our work for organizational research and personnel management. With that, I'll conclude my talk, and thanks a lot for listening.